Good evening, everybody. I want to invite you to Making Life Brighter, and my name is Winifred Adams. I'm your host. Tonight, we're going to have a very special Intel update on the world, and we have a special guest coming to speak about that. And I'd like to bring this forward to your attention. It's always in a timely manner, and not one I go looking for, actually. It kind of lands on my doorstep. So I would like to bring to your attention a new twist in a Supreme Court filing. I'd also like to bring to your attention something very important and near and dear to my heart, which is that of the Mission Canine Rescue. Now, I spoke of Mission Canine Rescue on Voice America last fall and shared with you the incredible amount of shared with you their dedication to duty. And what they do is they go and they reunite working service dogs or retired working service dogs with their handlers. And if they can't do that, then they look for a forever home for them. And that's a really special and dedicated job because these are very intelligent dogs that are the best of the best. They're trained as elite in their class, and they are used for every mission overseas that you can imagine. So what happens is, hello, Anthony, nice to see you. Haven't seen you guys in a while. Thank you for chiming in and saying hello. It's nice to see you. And so Mission Canine Rescue just got in all the dogs from Afghanistan from the Taliban. And it's taken them this long to raise the money and make sure it all came together, and they're having trouble doing that. And then those that rescued those dogs in Afghanistan were able to coordinate a very expensive flight to get them back. So now they're in Texas. And if you know anybody that could be a great forever home, if they aren't replaced or placed rather with their handlers, please reach out to Mission Canine Rescue. And you can look them up on Facebook and you'll begin to see their story there. This is really important because, these people have been working hard at making sure that these are really forever kind of heartwarming. I want to say it's like a legacy because when you've worked that closely, it's like having a soldier friend. Only your soldier friend gets retired and you never may see him again. So bringing them together right now is so important. So if the soldier can actually take the dog that they actually had, they seek to do that first. And this is such an important mission. And they are actually in need of donations. They're in need of any kind of help, and any people that might be able to take one of these dogs if in fact they don't find the handler that the dog actually had while overseas or on duty. Now, some of these dogs, well, all of those dogs were left behind. And so, yeah, that gets me. I can't talk about that too long. I won't make it. They were left behind, and one of those dogs is the dog on the tarmac that you saw in the video when the plane took off and left everybody. Anyway, by the good graces, because there are great human beings on this planet, and there's always grace and love happening around us somewhere at all times. I do believe that. And so, in this way, good people are doing great things. And the reason I got onto this, which I'm going to repeat in a little while here when I share with you a special interview that I'm going to bring forward, I was interviewing Sergeant Kotel about his mandamus about the withdrawal from Afghanistan. And so in the withdrawal from Afghanistan, they obviously unlawfully took our assets and left them there for the Taliban to use and other people to take and maybe move those assets around. Well, actually, the dogs were our assets as well. And they were just randomly left behind along with people. And in this case, there's a happy ending. So We're all about joy and love and happiness. And thank you for tuning in and listening. And I have a special show for you tonight because I have a twist on Sergeant Kotel's Supreme Court filing. Something's happened and it's a little odd. It's come out of the blue, actually. And I want to share that with you. More importantly, he's going to give us an update on the world theater currently and why that's so important, especially following on the heels of the recent posts from Full Colin Russell and J. Colin Gould. This all kind of coincides together, ironically, and I don't believe that there's any lapse in correct timing, if you will. If, the now space of what's happening in this moment is all kind of conjunct with other things. And so those dogs coming back just last week, that's amazing. That's amazing. So please reach out to them. You can find them on the web, and you can also find them. So if you know somebody that has a great property with space and, someplace that these dogs, or you can take a dog and they can have a beautiful place to roam. They're used to some pretty harsh conditions, and some of them need a little extra tender care or a lot of care, but they're very sweet. So you can find them on the web, Mission Canine Rescue, and you can find them on Facebook. I would like to share with you, without too much further ado, that we have a lot of things going on in our world simultaneously right now, including an up-leveling of the energy fields. The energy fields are moving. If you didn't feel the hit last week, the solstice and then this wave of energy that came, the Schumann resonance was high, and many people establishing themselves with some positive performances stirred the field, right? This field was crazy with energy last week. I know many of the light workers out there were completely flattened for a moment due to the energies that came in. And so we are sort of shaking it off at this point and standing up again saying, wow, all right, what was that? But here we are, and we have a new chapter that's beginning. And with your focus on the love and the light in the world, that chapter is rolling out. It's coming forward. So for all the bad that people are talking about in the world, there's also equal good. Just remember that. There's an enormous amount of serendipitous lineup. And I'm big about seeing the serendipity in things. It's really neat. So let's go forward in a positive light. And without further ado, because this is a hour and 15-minute interview, I'd like to share with you Sergeant Kotel and bring him back in, because this is so important for you to hear. There's a lot of history in this. It's firsthand. It's not conjecture. And it's something that maybe you can put some pieces together with, and especially with your own knowledge base, okay? So thank you so much, and please share. And without further ado, I'm going to bring forth retired Army Sergeant William G. Kotel. He is a CENTCOM intelligence officer and was in the Middle East theater and during the time of Benghazi, which is where we met to talk first about what happened in Benghazi. And you can see those interviews here on YouTube. You can go back and find those here on YouTube. You can also find them on Voice America starting in 2020, okay, under Making Life Brighter. So here we go. We're going to shift over and just to give you an idea of what I always deal with many of you know. When I started the interview with him, a phone that I had in my purse started ringing, and the little menacing internet rabbits that never cease to leave me alone were calling, but they were calling with an alarm. And I showed it to him. I said, look, this is what happens. And it was happening just as we began the interview. There's nothing that shows that there's an alert. There's nothing that shows that there's an alarm. It's just making this noise. It's doing this thing, and I have zero way to shut it off. And it just happens. So sniggly wiggets out there, you're not going to stop me. Just know that you're not going to stop me. Good luck. Good luck. We stand in the light, and I'm stronger than you are. Have a nice day.
Good.
Welcome, everyone. Thank you for listening. This is Making Life Brighter Radio, and I'm your host, Winifred Adams, and we are back. And I have our return guest, retired Army Sergeant William Kotel, and he is a former CENTCOM intelligence officer, and he is back to give us a quick update and also let us know intelligence CENTCOM officer, and he is back to tell us his story about the updates he has for us here and what's going on in the state of our world, as well as his mandamus and what's happening with him and that mandamus in the Supreme Court, what's taken place since we last spoke, which is very important. And I'd also like to begin the show with a shout out to Mission Canine Rescue. And Mission Canine Rescue was an interview I did on Voice America last fall. And what happened for Mission Canine Rescue is that, so Mission Canine Rescue was featured on Making Life Brighter, specifically because they have a very important mission of taking all working dogs, military working dogs, and reuniting them with their handlers. And the reason I came to that story was actually because of Sergeant Kotel, because he was doing the mandamus about the withdrawal from Afghanistan. And it made me research a little bit about these dogs because it's near and dear to my heart. And as you know, I did the interview with them about their purpose and their mission. And only now have they finally gotten the dogs back to Texas, to their ranch there. And those dogs are getting ready for adoption, but they went back, and all the dogs that were left behind at the Afghanistan withdrawal were just now flown over to the United States. And they even have the dog that was left on the tarmac, if you saw that video. So now they have that. And if you are someone that qualifies for having a dog like that and could stand that and would love to have a beautiful animal that needs a forever home, you need to reach out to Mission Canine Rescue. So that brings us back full circle to the conversation that we're going to have with Sergeant Kotel as to the state of the world, because ever since then, it's been a little bit dicey, and it's becoming more apparent to many more people that something is happening in the world that isn't necessarily correct. And we are coming to a place of fever pitch around the world. We've been discussing that here on and off and Making Life Brighter. And we've been following along with his case, which is really interesting because he's filing it in the fiction in terms of the Supreme Court, but they never answered him back. Now we're going to hear a twist in that story and find out exactly what happened. But first, we're going to get an update on what's happening in the state of the world, what's happening right now. So please welcome back Sergeant William Kotel, and he is retired intelligence officer. Welcome, William.
Thank you for having me back.
Thank you for being on. Yes, you have an update for us. So let's talk the state of the world, because I think we need a quick review, and everyone's focused on the border, but let's talk about what's really happening in the world theater.
All right, we can start there. So there's a lot of people that have a lot of news that they put out, and that's fine and dandy, but the reality behind what happens with Russia right now and their total aggression and threatening nukes right off the bat is Russian President Vladimir Putin had warned the United States and NATO, do not give Ukraine offensive weapons that can reach Moscow. That was a real sticking point for a long time. And due to the uncertainty of the Biden administration and the way he's been flubbing his lines lately and kind of messing things up, and it's, poor guy's just older, but I mean, he's not effective as a leader, and those around him are not giving him good and sound advice. President Biden thought it would be okay to move up this timetable for political purposes to give the Ukrainians offensive capabilities that do reach Moscow. That is what touched off President Putin to go into some of the Middle Eastern countries we're against and support them, and to send a small task force with a nuclear sub down to Cuba that's now docked in Venezuela to add to the 3 bombers that have been sitting in Venezuela now for over 2 years. So this is what's touched off this tinderbox moving up of these timetables. But conversely, President Biden has withheld military aid that was already guaranteed to Israel for Israel, hoping that they didn't have to go into Lebanon. We're not Israelis. We are not the ones taking Hezbollah rockets from Lebanon and direct fire attacks like the Israelis are. So that they're going to make their country safe. They have every right to do so. And we have no right to withhold any munitions, weapons, or financial support in this conflict. We just don't have the means to do that, especially when the Congress has voted for it and President Biden's withholding that, but ensuring that Ukraine is getting these offensive weapons. And I want to point something out to your listeners. President Zelensky is not doing right by the Ukrainian people. I mean, he really isn't. All his cities are rubble. There are no what are called sweatness services for anyone. That's sewer, water, trash, electricity. There's no infrastructure, medical, roads, school, nothing. So most of the cities in Ukraine are rubble. And there's no attempt to reach out to conduct any kind of peace arrangement. And with President Biden sitting here pushing these weapons upon him for more of a political venue, it is very scary indeed. And yes, President Putin has a lot to be angry about. He's not a good guy. Believe me, he's a bad guy. Excuse me. But he's really made a statement about this. Now, I've been sitting here looking at all this information that's come in, and we'll just leave it at the word information. And it is very clear that after the debate with President Trump and President Biden the other night, that it was very clear that he was not capable of running this country. But what was the rush to push these weapons to the Ukrainians as opposed to pushing forward a peace agreement? President Zelensky might have the wherewithal to say, I want to continue the war. But there are millions of Ukrainians that say, I just want a piece of bread and a dry place to sleep. I need medical, and that's really become more of a humanitarian crisis than anything. Now, I'm just sitting back as everyone else is, and I'm getting that, we'll say, information, and wondering at what point are they going to come to terms, whether Putin's a good guy or bad guy. You don't just go over and knock off a guy that has 10,000 nukes sitting in his arsenal. The
Now,
only advantage that anyone's had.
Excuse me.
Go ahead.
You have a little delay. Let's define why you say he's a bad guy from your position and your understanding.
President Putin's a bad guy because he went into Ukraine unsolicited and attacked civilian and military targets. And he brought in death squads to terminate any prisoners of war that he had. And those prisoners didn't just include Ukrainian soldiers. They included Ukrainian civilians. I mean, he's leveling civilian environments to rubble. I mean, totally unlawful. I mean, this is against the rules of war. And that was barbaric and heinous, and those are crimes against humanity. The only person in Russia that even stood a chance against President Putin was a guy named Mr. Navalny, who, by the way, he killed several months ago while being held in prison for 18 years. And I know that Navalny's supporters are out there trying to stop it. I know the Russian people are trying to stop the war because they don't want their husbands, wives, children, and parents to go off to conflict where they're getting really torn up a lot in the Ukrainian environment. But Putin's military has been pretty much thrashed, and he's using, second and third string people, against their will. He's conscripted them without their permissions or anything, kind of like the draft here, but much more in depth. And at the end of the day, Putin is not backing down, but neither is President Zelensky. And President Biden, who's sitting here in the United States, has just ramped up the rhetoric by giving him weapons that are able to reach Moscow, long-range weapons. And that is a big fear, and Putin warned against that many times over. President Biden did it, as I say, for more of a political stance to try to solidify his bid for president for 2024 elections coming up. And at the end of the day, we're still not seeing, like, Israel's getting its weaponry. We're still not seeing any stability in South and Central America. And this is where the Russian fleet has been hanging out. And we're not seeing any stability over in Taiwan. We're not seeing any stability in the Middle East. So a lot of areas of interest around the world that have American interests at stake are being neglected and ignored. Not to mention the number one thing in the United States that's a problem, which is our economy. You know, and President Biden has already made it clear he intends to raise taxes more than they already are. So people cannot survive. And
No.
the worst part is that jobs report is such a lie. It's showing new job growth of 200,000 plus the other month. I got news for you. That's not new job growth. That's a lie. What that is that's additional job growth. In other words, people that already have jobs have to go out and get either a part or full-time job just to pay their own bills. So yes, the jobs report is bogus, and it's just trying to show good numbers and good stats, again, for political purposes. I mean, this can't be allowed to go forward. And you know, the legal system in the United States right now, especially when you watch President Trump's, you know, civil and criminal trials, they're an absolute contradiction of the law. You have judges acting way outside the bounds of the law with the gag orders, and you have attorney generals from the state of New York sitting in the courtroom every day, and her presence there intimidates the judge because she can fire those judges, intimidates the prosecution and the defense, and also intimidates the jury. And by the way, she's derelict in her duties at being an attorney general for the state. So you have a lot of real, you know, problems with that. And nobody's gone to the chief judge, and we can get into that a little later. But if a former president of the United States in good standing, who's, by the way, a billionaire, has to go through this, what chance does a regular American have to go through this when they don't have the means and money to do any of this?
Well, it's definitely leaning toward some kind of totalitarian control. Now, let's go into your update on your mandamus, because this is really kind of an interesting twist in the story, as I mentioned. The fact that you're hearing about it 2 years later is really kind of a surprise. So tell everyone exactly what you received in March or April of this year and what you did about it.
Well, a quick rehash is this. Is prior to the pullout, I'm talking 2 weeks prior to 1 week prior of the pullout of Afghanistan in 2021, I had done a series of Inspector General complaints to the Department of Defense and Department of State. Now, Department of Defense shut the case down the day before our troops got killed there. And they were killed by an Al-Qaeda remnant that was there that everyone knew was there. And this happened under the quote-unquote Taliban's watch. So after that happened, and that pullout where we took 124,000 foreign nationals that we only knew about 20,000 of them and brought them to the United States, that was a huge security violation. So I did a mandamus to the Supreme Court of the United States to tell them that this administration needs to go back to Afghanistan, get Americans they left behind, actual Americans, and all our equipment and weapons and classified materials. And this includes certain things like aircraft and helicopters we left behind, and a lot of up-armored vehicles and lots of weapons. So when I submitted this to the Supreme Court, it was kicked back for corrections, which I did the corrections on them about a specific item, and I sent it back. And in February of 2022, my mandamus was withheld from me, and nothing was sent back to me. I called the Supreme Court from, February 2022, all the way through until March of 2024. Nobody ever responded to my phone calls. Well, then in April, I made a last-ditch effort. I called them, I left a voicemail, and I finally got Miss Lisa Nesbitt that contacted me back. And she stated, your court case has been suspended. It's being held, but it's not docketed, and we're not closing it, so you're not getting it sent back. He said, we sent you a letter in 2022. Told her I didn't receive any letter. Well, I received a letter a week later, and it's a copy, and it's dated May 17, 2022. And it's telling me, in a nutshell, that I'm supposed to go to a lower court in order for my case to be heard by the Supreme Court. Well, I sent back a document.
You're going backwards
Punch
to
them
go
back
forward
backwards.
when they haven't even docketed the first one. Go ahead.
Well, let me just educate for those that may not know. But you have a right to go to the Supreme Court if the situation is extreme enough. Okay.
Mhm.
And in this case, the situation was extreme. Remember, the Taliban sold a lot of military hardware and equipment, excuse me, to Iran and to Russia and China, as well as giving some to people like Hamas and Hezbollah in Lebanon. And the Israelis found proof of that they had some of our equipment that was left in Afghanistan being used against the Israelis in the Gaza Strip. But I wrote her back and I stated to her that I listed in my mandamus the extraordinary circumstances that the Supreme Court needs to hear my case with. So I went and did a rebuttal, and I highlighted throughout my rebuttal my original Supreme Court case where it showed the extraordinary circumstance, and I highlighted Rule 20.3 because that's what they keep using, was in my favor for this. And I don't expect to hear back from the court, not any time in the next probably decade, but at least I sent it back with those corrections made. And this is why there's so many problems with this country. When people are playing political games and they're in key positions. For example, Lisa Nesbitt is in the clerk's office in the review section. She effectively can block or stop any documents going forward to be docketed and heard by the Supreme Court. And it would be hard pressed for any of the justices to be able to see or know that, you see, because they're already dealing with cases. So she's in a very key position to do this, along with some of the other clerks that can go ahead and manipulate your documents. So this is already a huge problem. Now I'm sitting back here and this hasn't been done. The only saving grace was that Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene out of Georgia, Republican, had gone ahead and used my mandamus back in 2021 as an article of impeachment under H.R. 598. But it never went anywhere, and it wasn't expected to be used in that manner. I'm not accusing the Biden administration of being treasonous by nature. I'm just advising the courts to order them to go back and get our people and our material back. And I think that's pretty reasonable. You know, and of course, a short time after the withdrawal of Afghanistan, the United Nations with the United States agreed that the Taliban should run the country and they were going to honor them and give them a spot in the UN. They did it very quietly. And that's a huge problem.
Do you think that those things are even still over there? I mean, you're saying get them back. Haven't they been transported over the Ukraine by now? Haven't they sold off and used? They were stolen and repurposed someplace else, right?
Well, the Taliban's using a lot of it. They've sold some of it, and they've sent some of it to allies of Al-Qaeda or Hezbollah or Hamas to fight against Israel. And they're even offering to send some and give some of their own personnel to Russia to help fight against Ukraine. I find that to be very funny because recently in Russia, there was an attack that killed over 20 people in Moscow, including the chief of police, and the attack was conducted by extremist Islamic group that's there. And they've been having these type of attacks for a long time, and President Putin with his propaganda has stated, oh, it's Ukraine doing this. No, it's not. These are Islamic extremists. If you go back to the Boston bombing, the Tsarnaev brothers, they came from part of Russia, from Kazakhstan. They came from that area, and Tajikistan. And they were part of a Chechen group, and they went ahead and they conducted the Boston bombings. And the Russians warned us about that under Obama, but no one did anything to stop them. But the key here is that they have their own extremist groups. And if anybody doesn't remember, back in the 1980s, Russia invaded Afghanistan, stayed there for 8 years under a brutal dictatorship. They poisoned every water well, they killed everybody they could. Our own CIA supplied the Mujahideen at that time with stingers that helped to kick the Russians out after 8 years of horrific occupation. So they still haven't forgotten that. They're all about, insults, reproaches, and blood feuds, and they want their vengeance. So they're not exactly the Russians' buddies, but they're working their way around. So you're seeing a lot of these types of attacks happen, but under President Putin's watch, everything comes down, it's Ukraine, but by the United States doing it, when it's really not.
That's really interesting because, people are really concerned with all that we're shipping over there. I mean, it's evident. I'm going to bring up Monkey Works because he's all over those sit reps and things, and he's showing regularly how much things are going cross country on trains and things, and then they're being moved over to that theater. So our assets here, I'm getting some feedback on your end. Our assets here are definitely being moved around, but not necessarily for us here. So what do you say about that? Because if we're being distributed over there, basically stolen, or even our technology within this, our instruments, I mean, who's paying for that? And then what do we have here? What is a real scenario for our defenses here now?
Well, what we have is we have a couple of things right now. I guess National Command Authority has started to deploy some surface-to-air counter missile batteries, but the big thing is to move to THREATCON Charlie for the military bases, and they just did that, but only for overseas. THREATCON Charlie is a big deal because it allows for military patrols that are battle armored up, as well as attack air or aircraft to go ahead and patrol over base heads to ensure troops are protected. And then there's a coastline defense. So there are some improvements right now to security based off of this new threat by Russia, but it's still not nearly enough. There should be quite a bit more than what you see. And troops going overseas doesn't make a lot of sense right now. I mean, we could send some token forces to support NATO and what's going on there, but the reality is right now the United States is literally vulnerable at this point, thanks to the open border policy, the removal of all those Afghanis, and how many people right now are able to go ahead and sail their little ships or their planes and get over U.S. territories.
Yeah, I think we have an opportunity here for a real wake-up call. And if you were to say what we needed to do next, if you could, what would we do?
What we would do is we would go to THREATCON Charlie in the United States, and we would go ahead and set up a bunch of counter battery missile systems around the country. We would go ahead and tighten security in the ports using both Department of Defense and civil law enforcement. And we would go ahead and get fleets around the United States border areas, pushing enemy personnel or others far enough back to where there's a reaction time. If there's any subs, we'd chase them. We'd also close the border. And the border wouldn't be 100% closed. It would just be closed to all those other areas. We would deploy enough troops to ensure that happens. Additionally, the President of the United States can sign an act into order, and it's basically allowing the United States to take back bought properties by Chinese and Russian interest groups. Now, there's a difference between a civilian Chinese guy or a civilian Chinese people that buy these things for, say, restaurants or whatever, as opposed to the actual Chinese government of the PRK buying these pieces of property, and they're identifying themselves as part of being the Chinese government, who's currently against us. Now, we could do that with eminent domain if we chose to, and I think that would be wise because they've bought properties around military bases and around key infrastructures like upstate New York, dealing with the water supply and the water treatment facilities, as well as other areas near the bases, some bases holding nuclear weapons. This is a very significant security threat, and no one's looking at this and taking it seriously. They're too worried about happening again with the economy. You know, with the economy being so harsh on people, they don't have the money or the time to fight like they need to make the government do what it's supposed to do. So yes, the president can sign an eminent domain order and allow for those properties to be reconstituted for the United States government, and they can kick the Chinese off those properties and get them out of there. I think it's a very significant security threat. Excuse me. In Michigan, Dearborn, Michigan, is the highest Sunni concentration population in the United States. And supposedly, I hear rumors that they have a type of no-go zone, like France has a bunch, and that needs to end because they're getting over. And with Congresswoman Tlaib in office, she's from there. She has really created a bastion for these extremist groups to be able to operate and start to arm up and armor up to go do dirty deeds. And in Texas, we have the biggest Shia population, which again, Shia are supported by Iranians, and that population has to be dealt with. And I think Governor Abbott's done a pretty good job with that. There are no-go zones down there whatsoever, not like in Dearborn. So we have a real mixed bag of if you want to call them bad guys already in the country. Now it's a question of going after them and removing their rights to have lands or properties to be able to operate in, key areas, as well as to go ahead and slope and stop the border from being so porous, start kicking people out. Most of the immigrants and refugees you see coming across the border, they're Chinese or Russians or Haitians or Africans. I mean, they're not, and they're Middle Easterners, they're not Hispanics. And the Hispanics that are coming across the border are mostly Venezuelans. Most of them are fleeing for their lives for refugee status based off of what Maduro did with the killing fields back in 2017. But nobody's looking at that either. So everybody's got their wool pulled over their eyes, and they're not able to see farther than what am I going to be able to use to pay for my next month's groceries and bills, and the economy being so weak for everyone and being touted as being so strong, and with the Department of Defense playing games and letting, Afghanistan hold all our equipment and give it to whomever or use it for their own purposes, and letting Maduro run his country. Now, in Venezuela, in May, there was an election, and Maria Machado, who's actually the only real Democrat, and I don't mean Democrat like Democrat Republicans, I'm talking Democratic candidate who's not part of the People's Will Party, which are communists, won the election. He won by 80%. And Maduro deemed the election invalid and said she couldn't run because she cheated. And he used the head of the Supreme Court, who's the only one standing because he murdered the other three when they didn't comply with his orders 3 years ago. Now, that's a huge, huge problem. And Venezuela is the hub right now. The Russians, the Chinese, the Iranians are all in Venezuela. Maduro is sitting here with millions of dollars in Venezuelan gold that he uses bartering chips with Russia. And he's gone ahead and been totally against the United States, wants to send troops to Russia to help fight in Ukraine. And he sits there and keeps murdering the civilians. As of the last 2 weeks, there's supposed to be an election in July in Venezuela. Maria Machado's been going around the country, and she's got hundreds of thousands of people out supporting her. And Maduro right now is in fear of his life. And some of his allies, like President Silva de Lulu from Brazil, who's another corrupt bad guy, and people out of Nicaragua and Cuba, they are all right now teetering on which side of the fence to be on or be neutral. And they're not showing his support for him as they used to do. Now they're kind of like backing off from him because of Machado's followings. We are not taking advantage of that. And by the way, they're the biggest oil-rich country in all the Americas. They have the most oil reserves out of anybody here.
And gold. Only London stole their gold. They took a lot of their gold reserves and banked it in London, and then it disappeared. Maybe it went to the Vatican. I don't know, but
went to Russia.
Yeah, oh, well, maybe that too. And so going back to what you said about putting people offshore, how far offshore would they have to push them back?
Well, the international recognized limit is 12 nautical miles. So anything that comes within 12 nautical miles of the United States has violated United States sovereignty. That's what international law recognizes, 12 nautical miles. So when ships, aircraft, like the Russians did a flyby by Palm Beach near Mar-a-Lago, where President Trump lives, like 2 weeks ago, and they also had ships come within an 8-mile radius, they have violated U.S. sovereignty. That's required a response immediately. That didn't happen immediately. That took like a week and a half to respond to that stuff. Meanwhile, you have this nuclear sub lurking around. You're not even sure where it is, and nobody's pushing them back past that 12 nautical mile limit. After 12 nautical miles, they can go ahead and do whatever they want in the ocean as long as it's not threatening to the United States. But that's the legal and the law's definition of sovereignty.
How far away do they have to be to send a missile over to land on our soil? I mean, it's not, they could do that from way out there. It really doesn't matter, does it? It's almost like a moot point at the end of the day, how far away they are because of what they can do, right?
It's all about reaction time. The farther out they are, the more time we have to react, as long as we have, equipment in place and personnel in place to make it happen, to intercept. And that's the key. 12 nautical miles is just international law for country sovereignty, but pushing them back even farther would be better.
Well, what did you do with the base down there? You filed something recently with one of the bases down there, is that right? And were you approached them?
I live right next door to MacDill Air Force Base. I am 2 blocks from there. And I'm retired Army, but at MacDill, there are several tenant units. CENTCOM is one, SOCOM, Special Operations Command is another, SOCCENT, MARCENT. These are all tenant units that are there. They're big deal command units. And then there's MacDill by itself, which is a mid-air refueling station. Now, the problem is I told them that there was a lot of these single-engine propellered aircraft that were violating MacDill airspace right after the invasion of Israel by Hamas. And I've been talking to their security, their base commander. I tried getting a hold of Congressman Walt's office, a state senator named Jay Collins. I got a hold of his office. And I've tried to get a hold of the governor's office to advise them to let MacDill know they need to shut their airspace down and they need to put boat patrols out because they're right on the water. And they still haven't done it. I mean, there's a thing called Next Door Port Tampa that people can get onto to look around at local news here. And there were people on there bragging that they own a single-engine plane and they violated MacDill airspace, and they were laughing about it. I mean, these aren't military guys; these are civilians. So damage can be easily done, and that's a huge problem because these are significant combatant commands. There's also an element of AFRICOM sitting here as well. So you really have these bases right now that are quite vulnerable on U.S. soil to individual attacks and sabotage. Threatcon Charlie would definitely stop a lot of that and help with some of it that it couldn't stop. But you also have to have the responsibility as a commander to protect the troops, and to do that, you have to shut the airspace down, you have to shut the waterways down, you have to tighten up your shot group on your base.
Well, do we even have that going on right now? Is that even really something that's in the offing? And can they respond that quickly? It seems like we're spread out all over the place.
And the answer to your questions is no, nothing's been changed on MacDill. And I don't know what the congressman or the state senator did or the governor. I don't think they've done anything. And as far as response time goes, as long as the people are in place, already equipped and ready to go, response time could be almost instantaneous. But when you have to respond without having the equipment and everything in place, you have to go draw that equipment and do all kinds of stuff. And by that time, the attack's already happened. And that's the big fear.
Well, you're really more worried about an attack coming from the outside in or from the inside out?
Well, I would think it would be a coordinated effort, to be honest with you. I think it would be coordinated that people would come from the outside and try to attack inward, and then inward to attack outward. So I think it would be like a large-scale invasion. Of course not. What do I think? I think it would be a bunch of saboteur attacks, everything from cyber to, exploding certain areas around key infrastructures, and to attacks on bases that would be effective enough to disrupt military and tactical operations to strategic, possibly even national level. And that would be very catastrophic for us because the response time would be very slow, and it would be hard to determine both the damage and then what course of action to take.
Well,
Got to find who did it first.
I was just going to say, who would be responsible for this and what's their end game?
Well, I don't think any superpower would be directly involved, but they would use proxies. Like Russia would use, say, Al-Qaeda or Mahdi or the Taliban or other groups to go ahead and conduct their biddings. Even Venezuela, and their personnel. China would be the same way. They would be kind of like, we're not involved, but they actually are involved. They provided intelligence to the military equipment and the target location and funding and all kinds of things to allow these people to conduct those types of attacks, making America weaker so that they're weaker at whether it be negotiating table or international policy and law or the protection of Taiwan or protection of Israel. I mean, it could be for a variety of reasons or all of them.
And so going back to your filing, we're going to circle back again. Now, what will you do based on that? Do you think that any of these things that you're talking about just a minute ago have an effect on the timing of you receiving any information back? Why do you think that there was a 2-year delay, and why do you think that she is contacting you again right now?
I honestly think the 2-year delay was by design, by her. I believe that if you go back in history to when Justice Kavanaugh had a shooter outside of his house and almost lost his life because somebody in the Supreme Court leaked information, believe that that investigation came down. I know it was closed, and the Chief Justice said it was closed, and they thought it might have been a mistake. I think it wasn't a mistake. It was designed to look like a mistake. People had to start going back to doing their actual jobs. So when people don't respond to the Supreme Court, to those that are trying to find out information or just to file a case, then it becomes a significant matter, and you don't want to draw attention to yourself if you've done something wrong, but you start responding to people. Regardless of the response itself, you can show proof that you did the response. I think Ms. Nesbitt responded to me because she was in that precarious position and had to respond to me. But now I think, the documents that I sent back up will go ahead and be ignored, or if they're not ignored, she'll send a letter that I won't receive for probably a decade, and that'll tell me that my case wasn't valid for the Supreme Court, even though by law it is 100% valid.
Interesting. Well, one of the quantum people syntaxed your document, should you ever want to use it that way. I'll share that with you later, but they did. And very interesting because, she sort of was a shadow person, and then all of a sudden comes out of the shadow to tell you that, oh, well, you know what, we can't handle that here. And that's really what she's saying. We can't handle your document here. You have to go back down to a lower court and start there, which takes the onus off of her.
Which, again, is unlawful and illegal. She has to file the case by law. And the fact that I put out her name and information, I think is part of the reason I'm getting responses.
Well, she hasn't told you the truth. And actually, nobody's telling the truth as to what's really going on, as to why all this was never received in the first place, why it was negated out of the system, and why you're being asked to go around and be redundant again and to start somewhere else, when technically at this late hour in this game that's ramping up, that courts don't seem to even be functioning properly. They appear to be closed.
Well, speaking of courts, can I change subjects?
Please.
Okay. So something I want to elaborate on about President Trump, whether you like him or not, doesn't matter. When you look at him as a man or the former president, the actions taken in court, as I alluded to earlier, about the Attorney General of the state of New York, derelict in her own duties, come down to a civil trial where she's involved every single day, intimidated everybody in the courtroom, jury, the judge, prosecution, and the defense. That intimidation spills over to how the judge responded to President Trump as a defendant and his attorneys. In addition to that, he also went out and conducted media interviews almost daily in the most derogatory sense, and then claimed it wasn't politically motivated. I've never seen such a lie in my life. My resolution for President Trump in that case, along with the other cases he's involved with, is to have himself and his attorneys write a letter to the chief judge of that court, advising them of the unethical and unprofessional, unlawful behavior by the judge and the attorney general. I also recommend that he get with the Board of Professions, which has its own section for judges, and to file a complaint with the attorney general's office. Even though she's the head of it, it still goes on file in record. This way, the chief judge's name gets dragged into this, and he or she could wind up changing the nature and the statute of the case. They could wind up going down and saying this was unlawful, and this has to be a mistrial, or this has to be reheard in a better fashion because you did not give the defendant his rights. You didn't provide him his due diligence and his legal rights under the law to be able to do things. And the Attorney General had no business being in the courtroom based upon her actions of being able to fire or hire judges. So that is one major thing. And the second major thing is the gag orders.
Well,
These
before
gag orders are
before you
designed-
say that, wait 1 second. Why do you think his lawyers wouldn't have been all over that? Wouldn't they have seen that?
Lawyers typically, from my experience in dealing with lawyers in courts, they typically don't want to anger or upset a court system by going to the chief judge or going to the Board of Professions. Now, I've had to do it with the federal courts, and I've done it with state courts in certain cases, right? And I've had the chief judge come down and actually intervene. Now, I didn't make a good name for myself, but I'm not a lawyer. I don't need to have a good name. But lawyers try to keep their names good, and they just, basically they punt the football and say, guess what? we'll just take care of it in appeal. Don't worry. But see, by then it's too late, because now you're guilty in a court of law. The public thinks you're guilty, and you've just lost credibility. So you've been slandered and defamed unlawfully because of a judge who's corrupt and the lawyers that don't want to go after the chief judge and say, look, this is wrong, and the board of professions and say this is wrong. And that's something that needs to change, because those entities exist to ensure fairness in the courts.
Well,
I'll give you an example. Like if you go to Walmart and you have a store employee tell you can't do this, and then you say, yes, I can, and you call the manager over, and the manager sides with the employee, you're like, okay, I need to speak to the general manager. Who's in charge of you? And that's the person that will come down and resolve it and say, no, the customer is correct. You have to fix this. And that's something that's the same way if you look at it in the courts.
yeah, well, that's happening a lot lately, actually. Seems to me that the customer doesn't have much of a say any longer. So you were going to go on and say, you're going to continue.
I was going to go on and say that in the federal case where they went and they raided Mar-a-Lago, which was completely unlawful, the real legal problem with that was the warrant. Scope of the warrant was beyond reasonable. But what happened was the FBI agents took the president and his wife's passports. They were not on the warrant. So they weren't part of the scope of the warrant, and they held them. And when it was brought up to their attention by President Trump's attorney, hey, you guys got our passports, that's not part of anything, the Justice Department came out and went on the news and doubled down and said, oh, he's a flight risk. Right there, you have to look at how significant that is. You're talking about a former president of the United States in good standing, no criminal, no nothing, who's a billionaire, is a flight risk. What that did is that put Trump in the toilet. So in that case, he really does have to take a civil suit out against the Justice Department, have them both return his property, his passports, and issue a public apology in the news saying he was never a flight risk, it was a misspoken word or whatever they want to say, but they have to apologize to him, because that is slander and defamation to the highest degree. That is absolutely ridiculous conduct. They could not even have come close to doing anything worse than that. I don't know where his attorneys are on that either. I mean, I've tried to contact his attorneys and send them that information. I even went to Senator Tim Scott out of South Carolina, talked to his legal staff, and they said that he would pass the message to President Trump. I don't think it ever went to him. So I'm trying to get it to him so he can tell his attorneys what to do. They shouldn't be worried about having to see that judge in that courtroom again. They should be more worried about the law and representing their client, because that's what they get hired for.
Well, do you think that he has an opportunity to right his ship, if you will?
I think that President Trump could have this recent case where he had the gag order on him every single day, labeled as a mistrial or labeled as something unlawful by the chief judge because of the conduct by that judge. And because nobody invoked the chief judge's name and a complaint, nobody invoked the board of professions, now it can't be used. So they just kind of like sat back and let it go because it's almost like a little explosive device. They don't want to touch it. Point is that's their duty. That's what they were appointed for. So
Right.
I think President Trump can turn around a lot of these cases and make a lot of headway immediately and get this attorney general removed from office for dereliction of duty. I really do. I mean, the law supports doing things like that. It's just up to him or his attorneys to actually do what they're supposed to do. I haven't seen that yet. And, President Putin in Russia is waiting on this electoral outcome. And that's why I go back to what Biden did was political by giving Ukraine offensive weapons that can reach Moscow and withholding weapons from Israel after they've already been guaranteed by the Congress. President Biden doesn't have any legal authority to do that, but he did. And so he's done all this as a political scheme to get above President Trump because the courts aren't kicking his butt enough, in their opinion.
Well, it just seems evident that this person called Biden can't, lead is not even the correct word, can't function properly in his world at all. So what's the next step there? What's going to happen that you think, even before elections, what do you think is going to take place?
I think that what the Democrats are doing, my opinion, so this isn't fact, but my opinion is that they're going to push Biden to be the presidential nominee. They'll make sure that he and Kamala Harris win at all costs, and Biden will abdicate the presidency to the next in command, Kamala Harris, will be moved out of the vice presidency, and someone else will take it that will then become the president of the United States. That's the way they're going to play this hand, because they've gone too far with Biden. And the problem is the people that work with Biden and are pulling his strings, so to speak, they're the ones that could get in dire trouble off of all the dirty stuff they were doing with Biden against other countries or against the United States. You know,
Right. That goes back to
this,
Benghazi. That goes back to before all this. Back to when
Well,
Obama was.
that goes back to people like congressmen and senators that want to do the right thing, or regular people or attorneys or courts that want to do the right thing. They can't. Once that threat of, you know, I'm going to get destroyed, or I'm going to get my job taken from me, or I'm going to be thrown in jail gets removed, and they can speak freely. You know, I still call that cowardice, and you should stand up for what's right. If I'm a judge, I'm being told to do this stuff, and that's not going to work, and every other judge is saying do it or you'll be removed. I'd rather be removed. I wouldn't want to be part of that. I mean, because you have to look at, I mean, at the end of the day, you're all about yourself. You're your own keeper. You have your integrity, and you swore an oath. And you know, under the federal and the state laws, when you've sworn an oath of office, you can be held accountable under felony laws and misdemeanor laws for violating that oath. Why should these judges have to do that? Because they want Trump to go away and they want Biden as president? I mean, that doesn't make sense. Somebody had to either threaten or offer them something. You know, it's like the cartel saying, right? You want lead or you want silk? Kind of how I'm seeing a lot of this stuff around the country.
Yeah. Do you think it's all cartel run, including the Biden administration?
No, I don't think that at all. There's a
What do you
lot of
think?
very, very rich and powerful people that are helping Biden to stay where he's at, because they're making killing off of this, and they also have a lot of skeletons in their closet they don't want exposed. And meanwhile, the regular Americans, all the normal people in America that just want to have, you know, hey, my kids go to school, or I go to school, or, you know, I just want to go do my job, or I want to have a safe country. I want to be able to afford what I have. They don't have a say in anything. Again, if a billionaire who's a former president of the United States can get slammed in a small court for civil matters, there's no crime even, what chance does a regular American have to take something to court against somebody that's a big company that can pay people off? Most corrupt and unjust thing you've ever seen.
Tell me what you think the outcome would be regarding the election outcome, one way or the other, from Russia's point of view.
If President Trump wins, there'll be a big change in Russian posture as well as China's posture. There'll be a big change in people within the United States that are out there beyond the law. There'll be a huge change. There'll also be a change on immigrations. I think people are kind of either both, some of them happy, some of them kind of fearful of it. That's my opinion. My opinion is that the Biden administration is going to win come hell or high water. But I would have to say that if Russia is going to conduct any election interference, they're probably going to do so on behalf of Trump, not by his knowledge, not by him knowing it. So let's not start a whole rumor about what I just said. Just saying, foreign intelligence services always interfere with all elections, everything from state Senate to federal Congress, Senate, judges, you know, presidents, everything. They always try to interfere with that stuff. So I think that people would be out there from intelligence services trying to aid Trump to get into office and the madness, and other people that want the destabilization and the instability of the United States, they would want Biden to continue.
And so how would that affect Venezuela with us right now? It seems like people don't pay any attention to what you're saying about Venezuela, and yet it's sort of this blinking light in the corner.
Well, Venezuela in May just proved that they could go ahead and snuff free and fair election laws. I mean, Maduro came short of killing Maria Machado, and the United Nations, and no one is standing up and screaming and up in arms about the election, which I find heinous. Maduro is responsible for crimes against humanity. Right now, since 2022, Maduro has had Russian bombers that are nuclear bombers sitting in Venezuela. Now he's got Russian warcraft along with a nuclear sub sitting in Venezuelan ports. You have Chinese and Iranian influence in Venezuela. And you have cartel activity, and you have both Sunni and Shia terrorist activity in there. And Maduro is still head of the Sun cartel. Now, have that much negativity of all these different groups and adversarial superpowers sitting in there, and for us to not say or do anything about Venezuela when they're sitting on top of, like I said, most oil in the Americas, there's a problem. There's been a problem there. I did a mandamus in federal court to ask the President of the United States to conduct a police action with United Nations and host countries, go and arrest and remove Maduro for crimes that he's already committed, because he is clearly the threat that has created the immigration crisis. And he has destabilized all of South and Central America. Look, Venezuela had 7.1 million refugees fleeing from Maduro. They all went through all these other countries, Ecuador, Nicaragua, Costa Rica, all the way up to Mexico. And the Mexicans and none of these other countries want to hold them, and they kicked out their undesirables, and they're pushing them all north. And then added to the mix are all these Russians and Chinese and North Africans or Africans, Haitians, all coming to the border. And they're doing this huge push. Colombia couldn't hold the refugee camps down because the UN wasn't supporting them. And so Colombia is against the United States now. Nicaragua is against the United States. Nicaragua 4 months ago arrested 222 Catholics, one of them a Catholic bishop, for political arrest, which that's what they stated. There's no specifics behind it. They've become more communist. Cuba's come more emboldened as more of a totalitarian communism type country like it used to be. So we've lost stabilization in South and Central America. And President Silva de Lula out of Brazil is a corrupt guy that works with Maduro. His country is very against him, but he's got enough power to hold on to the presidency and support Maduro at the same time. It's like since President Obama took office and now with Biden, no one cares about South and Central America. That's right at our doorstep. And we've felt the brunt of millions of refugees coming across that we know of, not including that horrific airlift from Afghanistan.
Right. And what would you do to change that and move those refugees back home? How would you get them back home?
It's simple. Maduro gets removed. Machado takes the presidency like she won lawfully. He would kick out the Russians, the Chinese, and the Iranians. And then we would start repatriating the Venezuelans back to their country where they could go home and go back to a real life. And in the process of repatriating them, that's when we find all those other undesirables that are here. And we start deporting them or arresting them and detaining them for whatever crimes they've committed. We can put a kibosh on a great deal of stuff. We would stop the immigration crisis effectively, and we would be able to reestablish relations better with Mexico, Colombia, and Brazil, because Silva de Lula without Maduro wouldn't have a chance to stay in power. So we could reestablish those relations. And that would be a very significant thing for us to do. And get the bishop and the Catholics out of jail in Nicaragua, and we could settle Cuba down so they stop being so totalitarian and rhetoric-like.
Well, there's quite a bit of people that think that there's probably trafficking going on. Essentially, it's not all political. It's a different kind of political, and it's a little more insidious, even family to family, and for a network of people that are using human trafficking as a means of barter, even. Let's hope that even comes to an end soon, and that there's something that can be done. Although it seems like biting off one thing, there's lots of tentacles in all directions. As we look back at your case for a minute, have you researched Lisa Nisbet? Have you looked into her and who she really is?
Yes, she's been with the Supreme Court for like over 15 years. She was supposedly a very reliable person. She's a Democrat. She votes Democrat all the time. And that's pretty much all that there is on her. talk about who she clerked for, which justice, how she got in that position. That's her biography.
Do you know who she clerks for?
Not off the top of my head. I have to research that again. I don't want to tell any of your listeners something that's not true.
Okay. I'm not trying to put you on the spot. I just wondered if you knew. That would be interesting to know. It would be interesting to see if she would come on and speak about what she's doing. You said you couldn't get in touch with her, right?
I finally did. I had to leave a voicemail, and she called me back. And that happened just 2 weeks ago. So it was really difficult for several years to get her, a couple of years now, to get a hold of her or anybody in the courts. I just left a message for the general clerk because I wanted to talk to the chief clerk about why I'm not being responded to about my case, and she's the one that called me back. So she may have been one to intercept that call to make sure she called me back so I would be stifled again. Tried to tell me again I can't file, I have to go through a lower court and all this, and she had no valid reason or legal reason to tell me why I couldn't file my case the way it was, because it was an extraordinary circumstance.
Yeah, that's extraordinary.
Just to go back to your tentacle, I just want to go back to your tentacle comment about all these groups of tentacles. And I'm not saying Maduro is the key, but he is the key. Maduro is the key. Once he's removed and Venezuela goes back to a normal democratic country, right? And we start repatriating Venezuelan citizens, that's when we expose all these other immigrants, part of which are human trafficked, and we go ahead and expose cartels, we expose syndicates, other foreign adversaries that shouldn't be here. That's how we do it. And it would be pretty slow, but at the same time, it would be one person would be like a domino and it would roll. And you would continue to get bad guys and either deport or put them in jail. And this is how the rest of the South and Central American countries would get stabilization back, and the United States southern border would become normalized. And then the United States as a whole, we could ferret out whom we need to get rid of. And that would take place not over a great deal of time, but at least a couple of years. We could do that. We could start putting them back where they belong. And they would, I'm telling you, a lot of Venezuelans want to go back home, but they just really, can't, because they're going to die if they do. So now you really have to look at that one man, and I've said this over and over, is the cause for most of the problems at the border, the immigration issue, and it can be reversed pretty quick. I know it sounds simple. It would take a lot of manpower and other things that we do have in place already. But
well, it's interesting because you're always at the forefront of these things. I mean, it's you that's bringing up the things that are happening and filing on them. I've said that before, and I'll say it again. It's you that was showing me the pictures of what he was really doing to people way back. And that was when the other chaos was happening, called a plandemic. It's been going on for a while. And you're saying there can be a fix to it? While everyone's arguing about the border and this wall, do you think the wall is really realistic?
Yeah, I think the wall's realistic. I think the wall is a barrier that causes hard times and delays for those trying to enter. And those funnel points that don't have walls, or people that have means of trying to get around those walls, we would have law enforcement have a much easier time of determining where they are and to pick those people up and then get them deported or bring them in if they're, seeking asylum from refugee status or threat of life. I mean, so it would be a lot simpler to do that and not do it. The wall is just one tool in the arsenal. The whole arsenal deals with stabilization.
Right.
I mean, because when Mexico sits there and says, hey, everybody down here in the southern part of my country, just roll your butts up north and go ahead and hang out on the border. And when you get a chance, run. I mean, that's what Mexico's doing. They're just ferreting people through their country and letting them right in. And that tells you there's zero relations between President Biden and the President of Mexico. I mean, the President of Mexico could have easily stopped people at the southern border, just like he could stop them at the northern border and send them back. But he's not, which means there's zero relations going on. And no negotiations, no diplomacy, none of the things you would expect from an administration to have in that country. That's just one out of many countries that we have lost the ability to negotiate with.
Well, we've been having a lot of unrest recently in Los Angeles and other places. California's kind of gone quiet with Gavin Newsom. What do you know about that?
Well, Newsom wants to be the president of the United States, so he's trying to go ahead and correct the country a little bit through his own state's authority. This guy wants to come out and talk about $20 an hour as minimum wage. These minimum wage fees are so astronomical right now that people who own small businesses cannot afford employees.
Right.
So $20 an hour would be much worse. Then he's still letting people in through his southern border. He's not even trying to stop them until just recently when people started talking about him wanting to be a presidential candidate. That would be outrageous and ridiculous.
Yeah.
California had a $35 billion over a 10-year period given to them, $35 billion, build some kind of transit system, train system in Los Angeles. Never got off the ground, and nobody's ever got the money back. What's that about?
It's like a light rail
I mean,
system,
so,
kind of, and the extension of the Elon Musk program. Yeah, exactly.
But it's big questions, you know. Questions go back to money. Money goes back to the root of all evil. Money's what funds cartels, terrorist groups. It funds these bad guys to help politicians stay in office so they can continue to profit. Money's the root of all evil in these instances. So stands to reason law enforcement has a very simple mechanism of going after bad guys, and that's going after the money first. Shutting off the money spigot cuts off everything. It shuts everything down. The National Security Agency, the NSA, knows 90% of the bad guy groups that are out there and countries, knows all the banks that they use, and knows who funnels what money through where. And that includes with this horrible cryptocurrency, whether it's Bitcoin or another type of crypto, it doesn't matter. And they can easily shut off that spigot with a court order. And then they would be stuck. How does the cartel pay for trigger pulling gun toters if they can't pay them? Well, they're supposed to throw rocks? How does a terrorist group go to country without having some kind of support and supply mechanism in place? How do they get their weapons and explosives? Without money, they're not getting it. So money is a simple answer to going after these guys and shutting them down. And it's a good way of also targeting the financiers who are not the tough guys. Financiers are the ones that'll tell you who they know and everything, you could think of under the sun. They'll give it up. So this is a very, very big starting point. Then the other question becomes what courts, federal courts or international courts, who gets the money that's been absconded with or confiscated, to be distributed amongst victims or countries, however you want to do it. It doesn't really matter. But it's their money and it's gone.
That's a really good point. Now, from when you were in the Army and actually over in the Middle East theater until now, what have you seen play out that you saw coming that's now come to fruition in a way that you had maybe worked to thwart?
Three things. First off, in the Middle East, under President Bush Jr., when we were in the Middle East, Yemen was a stable country. We had Iraq getting stabilized as we were there. Iran was kind of put in check so it couldn't really be too aggressive. Israel was safe. And at least for the most part, they were safe. Okay. And most of the other Middle Eastern and North African countries were in good positions. That includes Egypt. When President Obama took over, the Middle East began to destabilize. In Egypt, you had the Morsi Brotherhood run by Abu Morsi, which is a Shia-backed, Iranian-backed terror group that they removed from the terrorist list after they killed Hosni Mubarak, the president of Egypt, and took over. After that takeover, our embassy was overrun. We had to get it back. We were told to get hands off, let the Morsi Brotherhood handle it. And then, by the grace of God, General named General al-Sisi, who's a Sunni, took back government through the use of the army. And now he's President al-Sisi, and he's a Sunni. And his whole goal is to keep the Suez Canal open because the Iranians and the Morsi Brotherhood wanted to shut it down. That would have been a huge blow. In Yemen, you have the Houthi rebels, which are Shia, and they're backed by the Iranians. attacking the Yemeni government that are Sunnis. You have Saudi Arabia for the last 10 years actively in conflict with the Houthi rebels, bombing sorties, supplying materials and supplies and even special forces to the Yemeni government to help stabilize them and get rid of the Houthi rebels and stop the Iranian aggression. King of Jordan, which is a predominantly Sunni country, has been trying to stay out of it, but he attacked groups of terrorists that were threatening his country borders. He's got no problem with that. But it happened so frequently under the Obama administration. The second thing that happened under the Obama administration was South and Central America were considered persona non grata. We did not get involved with those countries for whatever reason. When I talked with Southern Command about some of the linkages between terrorist groups, putting money into Brazil, funding terrorist groups in South and Central America to move north toward America, United States, all we were told we were allowed to do, according to Southern Command, was interdict drugs on the high seas. And if you remember that little moron, Joe Snowden or whatever, Edward Snowden, this guy came out claiming to the Brazilian government that America and Great Britain were listening to every phone call, viewing every email and every text message, which was a complete lie. He just grabbed classified material, didn't know what it was, and provided it to the media outlet down there. The Obama administration did nothing to reestablish relations with Brazil, nor did they slam Snowden enough to say this guy's full of crap, what he said. And they didn't do it, and it created this big vacuum. So now many people in South and Central America don't trust the United States or Great Britain because of what he had done. And again, you had the Obama administration do that. That was number two. Okay. Number three, under President Obama, we had minimal to no relations with Russia. They started to invade not Georgia, but Ukraine, and we supported them with some handheld weaponry. He came out and stated, we're not going to go to war with Russia over this, but we'll provide the Ukrainians with what assistance we can, and we'll negotiate through diplomacy with Russia to have them back off. Well, in the back of that, he conducted some kind of deal with Russia. That was a financial deal, helped them to back off. So to me, and to a lot of other people, it looked like, hey, he was being bribed. So Putin and them were being bribed about not going into Ukraine. I don't know if it was in regards to oligarchs and giving them back their assets, or if it was in regards to some other kind of financial deal or territorial matter. I don't know. But those are the three things that happened under the Obama administration when Biden was a vice president. So that fast forwards us to today, obviously, with Biden doing what he did. The pullout from Afghanistan was the most unlawful and illegal action that a president could ever take. For any agency like the inspector generals or military commanders to not stand up and say this is unlawful or illegal is a crime in and of itself. You know, General McKenzie, who was in charge of Central Command, bragging to everyone on the news that he had just airlifted 124,000 refugees out of there, patting himself on the back while 13 soldiers had been killed, and we lost all faith and credibility around the world. He left office in good standing, and now he's a professor at the University of Florida over here in Tampa.
Yeah,
So
that seems
nobody's
outrageous.
being punished. Yeah, nobody's being punished for violation of things unless you're not on that team, winning team, to just, look the other way or to do the wrong thing. It sucks people don't want to do the hard right over the easy wrong. They just don't. A lot of people want financial gain, and they want positions of authority or power, and they take it very quickly. And people using the threat of getting rid of someone's job or, threatening them with criminal action if they don't play ball is because they don't stand up and they don't do the right thing. You took an oath, you abide by your oath. A lot of people don't.
It seems that way. And I appreciate your insight into this, as well as your continued energy put toward your mandamus and the fight that you're currently engaged in regarding your case. So what do you anticipate next in your next step of your case? Where are you going to take that?
Supreme Court case, well, as far as the Supreme Court case goes, I anticipate to be blocked again and no response. I anticipate that I know that there was a very good case where the fishermen and other small businesses brought a case to the Supreme Court. Supreme Court ruled in their favor in regards to too much government oversight. This is a huge blow against government overreach and a huge win for small businesses, not just the fishing industry. And it's a very good thing that the Supreme Court heard this. So now with that in mind, and also with President Trump's case with the Supreme Court in regards to whether he could be removed from the ballot or not in certain states, which is illegal, they ruled in his favor for that. These are all big victories. This signals the Supreme Court is trying to make an effort to do their job. I hate to say it that way, but that's the truth. And the only way they can do their job and hear it is if people around them, like in the clerk's office, give them the cases they need to listen to. My case isn't one of them right now, and I don't think it will be, but I've already put it back up to the Supreme Court, and I think it's going to be hard for them to not respond to that.
Well, I hope that they hear this. I think somebody should send this over to Lisa and see what she says. And maybe she would have a response. Not likely, though. So, William, I'd like to say thank you for coming on again and sharing this important update with our audience, and also to give insight into how this system is working, because it's not lawful and it's not being told as to what's really going on regarding the lack of filing and why there's no stop and correct there. So you are being used as an example in this, and hopefully your fight is not in vain. So I want to say thank you for all that you do and all that you do for other veterans as well, because you definitely put a lot of time into helping other people in your free time, and for the safety and safeguarding as well as the education of our fellow citizens. So thank you very much, and thank you for being here always.
Thank you for putting it out.
You're
Remember,
welcome.
the mandamus for Venezuela is more important right now than my Supreme Court mandamus for Afghanistan, because Venezuela right now is tip of the spear for bad guy activity.
Yeah, it's real. It's happening right now in real time. And do you have any closing statements that you'd like to share with anyone?
Again, it's not all doom and gloom. You have to stand up. You have to say stuff. Get together with whoever you can. Church groups, school groups, friends, family, whomever. And everybody starts writing their congressmen and senators, tell them to stand up and do their duty, do their job, put stuff out, get information that you can get out there. You can do it from the computer from your house while you're having a drink at night or whatever you want. And you don't even have to be directly involved with it, but the more voices, the better. And it's very important that everybody stays really educated on things. I know the economy's hurting a lot of you people out there, and I'm sorry, because I'm getting slammed too, but at the end of the day, the economy is part of what really drives us. Just remember, Biden's already approving another tax increase. So just keep that in the back of your minds and know that we're already hurting. And I hope that you guys have a great day.
Great. Thank you, Sergeant William Kotel. And he is a retired Army sergeant. He was part of CENTCOM. He's an intelligence officer, and his intelligence is being continually used to help the American citizens. And I just can't say that enough, because so many people retire and then they're just done, but you seem to never sleep. You just don't retire. Mm-hmm. So thank you very much. And we will talk to you again soon. Stay safe out there, everybody. Go make somebody else's life brighter, and go jolly, as I say. Thank you for listening, and go to Mission Canine Rescue, and maybe you can find a home for one of those Afghan rescues. Thank you.